This past Ramadan, we saw a lot of bias incidents, hate crimes against Muslims throughout the United States and other parts of the world. One most recently and probably more devastating to people here local to the United States was the murder of a 17-year-old black Muslim girl by the name of Nabra Hasnain. What do you all think would be important for people who are not Muslim to understand at a time like this, especially in light of some of these things that we're seeing right now?
Gosh, it's crazy because I don't think about what other people need to know typically. I think, this was a question that in prepping for this I saw, and I typically don't think too much about what other people should need to know necessarily, but I kind of think in more protective measures about like the community and the community kind of, just thinking about whether it's learning martial arts and self-protection and that kind of thing, but, just being tighter as a community. And, with the situation with Sister Nabra, may she rest in peace, then, I don't know, I guess you're saying maybe it was concluded that it was a hate crime, but I don't always think that every time a Muslim is killed by somebody who, just because she wore hijab, then the person that made them think, oh, I hate this person, let me kill this person. I don't know the full aspects of what happened, so I can't speak too much on that, but I think the typical things that you would want someone to know if they're being prejudiced against another group, or if they have hate in their heart, is that, do not take out your anger on a situation that has happened, at the hands of someone you don't know, the person who you're making a victim doesn't know. Like, don't take it out on just a random person. I think that's, a basic thing, and that, obviously generalizations hurt people, prejudice, racism, all of that hurt people. So I kind of feel like it's just the same thing that I would want anyone who is being racist or xenophobic, or I'm not sure if we've developed a word for somebody who hates somebody because of their religion. What is that word? But if, in that case, like, yeah, those generalizations and just trying to take that out on a person going vigilante is not the answer, like, clearly.
I might add just a little bit to what Nzinga said. I think, what happened to Sister Nabra is, part of a spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes that we've seen, beginning with the presidential campaign, right, in 2016 and all of the anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so we've seen many incidents like that, unfortunately. Sister Nabra, what happened to her was not the first. There were two Imams in Queens here in New York City who were gunned down in cold blood over the summer. Yeah. There were sisters in Brooklyn who were assaulted, who've had their hijabs ripped off on a regular basis. There was even a sister who wore hijab who was set on fire in Manhattan. Wow. And I think it's important to think about what sets the stage for these hate crimes and the extent to which official government policy and official rhetoric really enables that sort of violence and gives permission to private actors to act on their prejudices and on their biases and on their racism. So when you have, here in New York City, for example, an officially sanctioned police surveillance program targeting Muslims, that gives permission to private actors to engage in that sort of conduct against Muslims. When you look at what the US government is doing domestically and overseas to Muslim-identified communities by way of exclusion, predatory prosecutions, all the way up to elimination by drone strike, occupation, invasion, war, that also gives permission because all of these policies seem to be targeting or are targeting Muslim-identified communities and societies. So I think in very real and concrete ways, what our local, state, municipal, and federal government does domestically and overseas, its rhetoric when it comes to Muslims, is a large part of why we're seeing these anti-Muslim incidents at the hands of private actors.
Mm.
Let me add a little bit, if I may, too. This is going to take forever, isn't it? But I do feel that it's a shame, actually, that we have to begin with a question like this. I completely understand it, but I think it's really a shame because there is more to Muslim American life than hatred, and there's more to it than the violence, and there's more to it than the suspicion. But that's also very, very true, and I know we're going to get to a lot of that other stuff, right? But it's also very, very true that Muslim Americans right now are extremely vulnerable and extremely scared, many of them, and for very legitimate reasons, as we've just been hearing from other panelists. And I think what's really important to understand is that in the general culture, it seems like Muslim Americans have to fight for recognition that their pain counts. And that seems extremely unfair to me. And so we have an example of this, not only in the case with Nabra, was this a hate crime, was it not a hate crime? But we had an example of this also in North Carolina with the 3 students. That was just 2 years ago. And the official narrative very quickly became, oh, well, that was a parking dispute. And the official narrative became very quickly that it was also some kind of altercation, like a traffic altercation. As if hatred against somebody on the basis of who they are has no bearing also on traffic disputes or on parking disputes. And so it's as if, there's a way that we segment out the pain and the threat that have attached to Muslim American bodies and really Muslim bodies these days. And I'm sure that nobody in this audience feels that way. But I feel like this is something that the question is asked, what should the general public sort of take away from this? That seems to me to be something that the general public has to be aware of, is that there is a level of acknowledgement of Muslim pain that I think that's actually absent from our general culture today.
Sorry, just to add to that as well, I think that, again, everything everyone has said has been spot on, but I also think when it comes to Muslims and Muslim life, I think we are also somewhat limited in who we imagine when we think about Muslims. I know there was a lot of conversation around Sister Nabra and the fact that she was a black Muslim woman, which means something very different in the general imagination, but also in general. I think if we are to look at Muslim lives, then we must look at them intersectionally. And I know that I stand here, or sit here rather, as a Muslim but also a black woman who doesn't wear hijab, for example. And I think that the way I move through the world is very different to how another black Muslim woman in another part of the country who does wear hijab. Our experiences are very similar, but they are also very, very different. I am not processed, for example, immediately as a Muslim, but Nabra and her friends would be because they were hijabis. And that's something else to consider, that we are looking at multiple identities colliding in so many small and large ways, and it would behoove the general population to think wider, that we are not one monolithic block, and that we look very different and we live very different lives, even within the same group setting that we all seem to be put into. And that's something that people need to consider. I know that there were lots of people who were talking. I'm very often on Twitter, which is a poor waste of my time, but sometimes there are some really good conversations. And there was one black Muslim woman who just said, so many of you speaking right now have no idea what it is like to walk in the world as a black Muslim woman. And that just kind of shut a good number of people up, because there was a lot of conjecture, like you were saying, were they attacked because they were Muslim, or, and there's all these conversations which I think for other marginalized groups, historically marginalized groups, were not new. And so for me, I kind of hark back to immediately post 9/11 when I was living in London, and a friend of mine who is a hijabi, and she wasn't at the time, but she was saying how she felt very unsafe. And she felt that everyone was looking at her, and she felt that she was being followed and so on. And I was nodding, and I was completely sympathetic to it, because I fully understood what she was saying. But another part of me couldn't help but say to her, oh my God, that's my life as a black person. So, this is just another layer of nonsense on, this kind of layer cake of nonsense. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about all the time as well, that there are multiple identities colliding and living quite happily until they are disrupted by outside forces, and that's something for us to be thinking about as well.
I mean, I think even in her case, I mean, the narrative kept changing about, I mean, or even developing about her identity even. I mean, when I first saw a picture of her, I didn't know she was Black. I didn't read her that way right away, as what happens with a lot of Black people anyway. But you know, who knows how she identified. I mean, she was Egyptian. You know, I heard her father speak. Her father spoke with an accent. He was an Egyptian man. They're Nubian Egyptian. So it could have been, if you were saying there was a bias involved, it could have been xenophobia. It could have been, you know, her being Black, if that's the way she identified, or we identify her as. It could have been her religion. It could have been none of that. It could have been the altercation that happened previously with the boys in road rage. I don't know, you know, but any kind of hate and bias is just crazy and wrong, you know. Yeah, I mean, I really got what you were saying earlier about that thing of the aspect of putting more value on when a crime is done against a Muslim. And I feel like the complicated situation is that because we hear so much in the news about terrorism, and of course every time there's a Muslim who's a perpetrator of a crime, then it's automatically assumed that it's automatically assumed to be linked to the state or some kind of terrorist allegiance right away. And by the time things are even, a lot of times stories in the news aren't even developed to its conclusion for us to even find out if they actually concluded that this person was really a terrorist. There's the next thing in the news cycle. But because that is there so much, and then if a white person commits a crime, it's typically never linked to the state. It's not even linked to anything at all. It's just the person was probably crazy, probably mentally ill, and that was it, not linked to any affiliation of anything. So there's nothing to be researched into. It's just an odd thing, even if it happens over and over again. Then the idea is that, okay, well, this person, when a Muslim is killed at the hands of someone who had some kind of hate or felt like they were doing it on behalf of something political, because I think if you're doing a hate crime in this form, then there is something like, to do with politics, something that happened, terrorism, this is to get back at because of some larger thing that happened. Then it's like, okay, maybe it's seen as like this person, it's kind of like collateral damage or something, Yeah.
So I think we could pull a lot of different frames out of all of these responses tied to institutional policy, political rhetoric, media narrative that shapes for a mass population what they perceive Muslims to be. And I know for me, one of the more not frustrating, but a regular question that I get asked by media, by audiences, is, well, what do Muslims think? As if Muslims are this one homogenous body that every single one thinks exactly the same and has seen the same things and had the same experiences. And both within the Muslim community and outside of it, there tends to be this very sweeping generalization of who a Muslim is, and then in turn what we understand Islam to be. Mm-hmm. So how would you describe just the Muslim community, even here in New York, or more broadly the United States? We're coming together to engage the question of who is a Muslim, but what would we really say as a response to that if we were asked, how would you answer that?
Let me start this one, if you don't mind. I think that Islam in the United States is the history of the United States. One of the really interesting things, it seems to me, is that if we study the history of Muslims in the United States, we study the history of the United States in really interesting fashion. In the contemporary moment, the Muslim American population is only perhaps 1% of the population of the country, around that. And yet it comes from 77 different countries of origin. It makes it one of the most pluralistic, if not the most pluralistic community of religious devotion in the country. So it has something to say, in other words, about a kind of multiculturalism in the United States today. And its origins go all the way back to, in the United States, go all the way back to before the United States. I'm sure people are familiar with this, but there's a great history in this country around Islam in America. There were sizable numbers of people who had been enslaved from Africa and who came to the United States in chains and then were forced to work, who themselves were Muslim in faith and belief. And their stories are incredible stories that really should become part of our curriculum as a way not just of teaching about what the slavery was in this country in a more complex fashion, but also of teaching the history of Islam in the United States. I mean, you can look at the history of the Black liberation struggle also in very interesting ways through, of course, a Muslim lens. You can look at the history of American imperialism through a history of the Muslim lens as well. And I don't say this to say that you should be looking at these things in an exclusionary way. I'm saying we should be looking at our own American history from multiple vantage points, a million different groups. How did that, what would an LGBT history of the United States look like alongside a really rich Muslim American history at the same time, and from every different group, rather than having a kind of singular narrative that drives the one story of the country forward, that sees it as a story that really begins in Europe. And that's not really what this country ever was, if you are looking at its foundations, if you're looking at its origins, if you're looking at its complexities. And so I think that would really do a lot also to displace this idea that somehow Islam in the United States really begins on September 12th, 2001. Mm.
I mean, I'm a foreigner in a foreign land, so I haven't really had a lot of time, by virtue of the nature of the work that I do, to kind of find a community of my own that is a larger community. My experience of being a Muslim, I've been a Muslim all my life, and I was literally, I went to an NYU iftar last week, towards the end of Ramadan. And that was the first time I had been in a room with more than 50 Muslims in maybe a decade. Oh, man. Because I have found that it's very odd. I grew up across Europe and Africa. So I was born in London, we moved to Nigeria, and then we zigzagged for a few years, as is the way of many immigrant families. And I always found myself more comfortable going to the masjid in Nigeria than in the UK. And that for me was down to issues of representation. We talk a very good game about the global ummah and how we are all, we're all equal and we're all the same. And of course, because we are human beings, there are very many interpersonal issues. And I never felt comfortable going to the mosque in the UK, not very. I had a couple of bad experiences that just made me kind of go, I'll just pray at home, it's fine. And going to the NYU iftar and looking around that room and seeing so many people, you were saying, just looking at, every shade, every color, all these languages that were coming up, and people had all these histories and, second generation, third generation people. And looking at that and kind of going, wow, I'm 16 months into living in this country. And I felt very, very emotional just kind of sitting there and having all these people. And there were, it was all kinds of Muslims. And that to me felt like a really kind of, that would be a wonderful snapshot when we're talking about Islam in America. I think often about the fact that for many, many Americans of this generation, a couple others, the first Muslim that they knew was probably a black man. It was probably Muhammad Ali. And then, there was Farrakhan and all these other people. I think about how we have this idea of Muslims as, brown. For the longest time, Muslims in the American imagination were black. And because of September 11, 2001, and, the post-9/11 world, suddenly every Muslim was brown. And they were, Asian. And it kind of erased and kind of pushed aside a lot of other stories that were going on. Even in the discussion of the Muslim ban, in its first iteration. And people were talking about, oh, it's going to ruin all these people's lives. And no one seemed to focus on the African countries that were listed in there. And everyone was talking about, Iran, obviously, because it's Iran. But no one was talking about Sudan, which is huge. And I just kept thinking, and there was it was a journalist or a writer on Twitter, Rahawa Haile, who said, is anyone talking about the fact that 50% of those countries on that list are African countries, and these are black Muslims, and we can't separate the two. And so I think a lot I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of representation because it's something that I am constantly in my work. I'm a culture writer. I'm always looking at representations. I'm looking at the images and the stories that are told and how we are socialized into believing certain things about certain groups. And I'm coming also from it because I'm a black person. I'm always thinking about as well what happens when you add layers onto black identity. And that's something I'm always thinking of. And sitting in that room that day, eating a delicious halal lasagna, I was thinking and looking around the room and realizing that this is something that more of us should be talking about, within ourselves. Because again, just like Nzinga said, I sometimes think, well, I don't really care what other people think to a certain extent. We should talk about this more within our own groups, our own spaces, and then that will extend as well to other places, is my view.
I'll just add very quickly that so the organization that I work with at CUNY Law School, CLEAR, we go into a lot of different Muslim communities here in New York City and larger tri-state area and even beyond. So since 2009, we've done literally hundreds of workshops in different Muslim communities, and the diversity of just New York City's Muslim communities really reflects the diversity of the Muslim community globally. And so, we've gone into Albanian mosques in Staten Island, as well as, West African, East African, North African communities, predominantly Yemeni communities, more locally here in Brooklyn. Literally every variety, shade that you can think of, but also socioeconomically. Many Muslims in New York City are working class, they're driving cabs, they're pushcart vendors, they're selling coffee on the street. Some are doctors. You have muppies, which is Muslim urban professionals. You have mipsters, which are Muslim hipsters. And all of these communities congregate in different ways and exhibit different degrees of religiosity. But the one fundamental fact that I think is very important to remember is that, along the lines of what Bim was saying, there's this reflexive association of Muslims with foreignness, with otherness, when the fundamental historical reality, which Moustafa was pointing to earlier, is that Islam has been in the United States for as long as the United States has existed, for even longer, and even today, 1 out of 3 Muslims is an African American Muslim. And so there's a very long history of American Islam in that community specifically, and many lessons, I think, to be drawn from that community, from the African American Muslim community, that can be of great value and have been of great value recently in times of crisis and targeting for predominantly immigrant Muslim communities.
Islam has been in the United States a lot longer than Donald Trump's family has.
So in my view of, the question was who is Muslim, right? Is that the question? Something like that. But I think for me growing up, I've always existed in a variety of different communities. I'm from Brooklyn, and the mosque that I consider my home mosque has been around since the late 50s. It's a mosque that was founded by Malcolm X, and started out in the Nation of Islam when Elijah Muhammad died and Warith took over. Then they made the shift with Warith Muhammad into more Orthodox Islam. But it we definitely carry on a lot of the good aspects, a lot of the good things that, a lot of the good trainings and teachings that were in the Nation of Islam. So some people have very stringent diets still, like a lot of we call them our pioneers who are like 60 and up. A lot of them have a diet that consists of one meal a day or 2 meals a day, something that they learned in the Nation of Islam. And we practice martial arts is a very big part of our community. There's a dojo in my mosque, there's a dojo in the mosque down the block, Masjid al-Taqwa, that's a big part of Black Muslim culture that also came from that history. But we practice Orthodox Islam, pray 5 times a day. Most people cover, and but our culture is very much like a African American and Caribbean culture. So when it's time to celebrate Eid, we have a block party, right? When the weather's good, we have a block party. People sing calypso, people do James Brown impersonations, people, there's always a martial arts demonstration, people perform like hip hop, all of that kind of stuff. So that is like, for me, what I grew up as seeing as like Muslim culture, like Black Muslim culture. Then, of course, I grew up around other groups, and my family exposed me to other groups when I was, young, and then I took it upon myself more so once I graduated from college and was looking for just having more time to be social, just being in all kinds of different communities, whether it's the NYU community, I'm a part of Muppies and Mipsters, and just being within these different groups where there are various cultures. Like if you're Muslim and you're, from South Asia, you have a culture that is South Asian culture, and you're also Muslim, but a lot of times that's conflated as being like Muslim culture, right? Because a lot of times those people grew up around, whether you're, South Asian, maybe even probably African and Arab, if you grew up in a country that's predominantly Muslim, then your identity or your idea about what is Islam is whatever your people are doing, right? But then if you come from a culture where you are very much American, because you're African American or you're like Caribbean American, which at least for my parents' generation and for myself as a child of Caribbean American parents, and we really just kind of gradually started to identify a lot with the African American community or gain an understanding and a certain just a strong understanding of what their thinking was and why, that kind of stuff, even if we didn't have the same exact history. So it's kind of like this merger, but there was always this idea that I always grew up with this idea from my father that was like, when it comes to your culture, like who I am as, an American and a Caribbean American, and Islam, then you take your culture and you funnel it through Islam. So Islam is like, it's going to teach you your morality, it's going to teach you have to pray, you don't drink alcohol. These are the things that I, knew, like, okay, you don't drink alcohol, you have a certain diet, you abstain from sex until your marriage, all these different things. And if the larger culture has these aspects in it that are not in Islam, then you funnel that out, but everything that's good, you can keep it. And that's what I learned growing up. So I knew there were lots of things that I can do and things I could take in from American culture and Caribbean culture, but things that I didn't. So for me, even as a Caribbean American, Carnival is like a very big deal. My family's Trinidadian. And when I was younger, they would take us to Carnival when I was a little girl. But then, and my parents converted to Islam. My dad when he was 19, my mom when she was like 26, and they got married in their early 20s. We used to go to Carnival when I was a kid. But then after a while, as my dad's kind of thinking, or he started kind of looking at Carnival like differently, because he's like thinking in terms of like modesty, and he started thinking, maybe this is not so good to have my daughter seeing people all, gyrating on each other and just all of the huge like party atmosphere. So it was just like, okay, that thing, I'm Caribbean, I can listen to the music and everything like that, but Carnival, I'm not going to partake in Carnival because I'm Muslim. And so it was always this kind of this sensibility, this awareness that I knew. I was always able to separate it, but some, if you're always like, you're in it, everybody, if you're Egyptian and everybody, not all Egyptians are Muslim, but if you're of a culture where you see that as such an intrinsic part of being, let's say Pakistani means Muslim for some people, then you might not be able to funnel things out as much. But then another thought about the Muslim community that I want to share is like, I almost feel like we had this term that was such a strong term, I don't hear it as much now, but like Ummah. We always had this idea of like Ummah, meaning Muslim, like this global Muslim village, like this global Muslim like idea. And to me, it's almost like the American idea, like this thing of like, we the people and all these ideals that we strive for but are not perfect with as an American, like that it's freedom, liberty, all this kind of stuff, that to form, a perfect union, right? To form a perfect union. And it's, you strive for it, this is the ideal, and then like the Ummah, there's this ideal that I think brings us together like a lot, where it's like, you just kind of have this kind of trust in a sense. I grew up with this feeling of just like trust. If that person is Muslim, then I trust them because they have these certain morals that are good that we just like abide, that just makes us kind of get each other, Some of that has withered away a bit with, after 9/11, even that sense of high alert that America, America has kind of like had about, Muslims and terrorism or whatever, that's affected our community as well, I think. But yeah, we have many, many layers in being Muslim.
And I think it's interesting, if we go back to Professor Bayoumi's comments about the historical roots of the country, you definitely have estimates of about 30% of slaves that came here were Muslim. The settling of certain colonies like Roanoke had people who were Muslim that were Turkish and Moors who were present. In Iowa, the first mosque built in the country was in Cedar Rapids by Lebanese immigrants in the late 1800s. And trying to understand that in the frame of what Bim is saying and how it's very easy to have identity erased, to be present but still be invisible and to not be kind of recognized, I think also goes back to some of the historical roots of the country where aspirations of individuals coming sought a land that embraced immigrants and diversity, which was very distinct from the European context in which people were leaving from. They didn't seek to embrace diversity in that sense, even on a theoretical level. And where you had the literal launching of crusades, transatlantic slave trades in the name of religion, and then an embrace of the secular and liberalism, saying that spirituality and faith are kind of, the bane of everything in society, so let's go in a different direction. This country didn't fight its worst battles in those frames, but it fought its bloodiest battles, its civil wars, around race and class. The foundational documents of the country literally afforded full privilege to white men, gave nothing to women, and didn't even equate black men and women as a whole person in comparison to their white counterparts. And I think that's an important thing to understand as I'm hearing from you all, and how it ties to the institutional developments and policies that we see today. There is like this deeply entrenched mechanism that impacts minority populations of all backgrounds that necessitates us understanding a foundational anti-blackness to be able to then address what is symptomatic and manifests itself in the form of an anti-Muslim identity. And I think today we see multiple realities that even if we weren't aware of it from decades or centuries ago, it's something that you can't really deny anymore. How do you think a broader American society can start to deal with some of the challenges that we have here that are definitely impacting Muslim community, but even through intersectionality or to look at distinct communities, is impacting a lot of minority populations tied to race and class? Like, what do we as diverse individuals do to be able to harness a much needed pluralism that allows for us to be a part of a solution to this and move beyond just a conversation that enables us to individually come together better and then start to take on some of the institutional issues that are really infringing on the day-to-day lives of so many?
Do you want to go? I think the conversations are an important part of what will eventually come. I think a lot about the ways in which certain communities and certain groups have learned by virtue of the fact that they had to in order to survive. And I think about my conversation with my friend post 9/11 and this new awareness that suddenly was her reality of like, oh my goodness, suddenly I'm, a target. And I was able to then kind of fall back on my many years of being a black person and say, oh, mate, that will happen. Don't worry about that. Just keep going. But I think the conversation is the beginning of the change. I think none of these things are easily won. And I think for many people, we're still fighting some battles about even bringing a level of awareness. The fact that Muslims are many things. The fact that the media, and I say this as a member of the press, the media has its own narratives as well and are not necessarily as independent as you would have hoped. And so the idea of questioning things, the idea of seeking answers, the idea of, which is, again, a very, very difficult thing to do when you are told to not trust, what was traditionally seen as trusted sources. And this kind of, there's been like a society-wide, on all levels, erosion of trust. And that, I think, is the thing that is going to be how we reckon with how we choose to treat marginalized and minority ethnic groups, and not just ethnic groups, but minority groups in general. There's a lot of conversation, for example, around the idea of Americans of lower incomes, around this healthcare debate, for example. And these are perspectives that nobody was looking at before, because it didn't fall to anyone to, the poor can suffer, whatever. And then suddenly there is a moment, a tipping point, where we're all kind of pushing and pushing and pushing towards something, and then suddenly that becomes like a big story about the disenfranchised, and again, talk about separating groups. Suddenly everyone was concerned with the white working class, and no one was thinking about all the other people who are working class who are not white. But anyway, and I keep thinking about the ways that having conversations and pushing boundaries and these things all they're all part of a domino effect, where we have the idea that we have one mode of attack, one mode of tackling a problem, I think, is something that we have to kind of get out of thinking. This is something that happens at grassroots levels, and there are so many organizations doing amazing work across levels. And it has to be a multi-pronged approach, because otherwise there are cracks and people fall through them. And that's when you begin to form a narrative, as we are in now, where we talk about Islam in America and we're talking about brown people and not black, or whatever. We're talking about a specific group. We're talking about, rich doctors as opposed to the working class people who drive cabs and the people who, are street cleaners and, struggling, and people who have children who don't have children. Or we're talking about, and these are all small things. It starts with, the idea of the representation of who is Muslim. I'm thinking about your work, for example, with Homeland, and we spoke about this on a podcast that Buzzfeed produces called See Something, Say Something, and we were saying about seeing the Damian Lewis character. If anyone's ever seen Homeland, I think in the very first episode or so, he prays, and it's the stiffest praying you have ever seen in your life. He kind of goes, Allahu Akbar, and I'm like, what's wrong with him? Like, what are you doing? But it's so odd. But even seeing that, and that, that idea of the equating of certain, these are all things that I think we're all trying to kind of challenge and to move past. And that is the beginning of something. And those conversations that follow on come from oftentimes conversations that don't feel necessarily helpful, but actually are. I would say that because I'm a talker as opposed to, I'm not in policy, I'm not in government, but I think these are things that we have to consider, that it's from all levels, and it's people working in tandem with one another, with organizations, with groups, with all these other structures that help to kind of push everything forward.
I think that if you are interested only in your own liberation and not in the liberation of society as a whole, then that's not liberation for anyone, right? And so there's a way that Muslims and Muslim Americans have to be deeply concerned about everybody's liberty. But that's also actually, on the other side of things, there's a tremendous opportunity around Muslim American issues right now, because Muslim American issues are also at the core. You don't have to convince people of this anymore. I've been doing this work for a long time. You have to really convince people that there was like a reason why you should be paying attention to Muslim American civil liberties issues. And now you don't have to convince people anymore. Everybody knows that there's a reason. And, but there's a really important element to that right now, I think, which is that you know, now I think we are starting to see something that many of us have known or intuited for a long time, which is that fighting for Muslim American rights is not really about the rights of Muslim Americans only. It's really about fighting for what the principles of a kind of society you want to live in will be. Mm-hmm. And to that degree, I think one of the most reported, or not reported, but under-theorized things about our contemporary moment is that when we talk about the situation of Muslim Americans, we often put them in the frame of U.S. race relations for a very good reason, as we've been talking about here. But when we think about race relations in the United States historically, we tend to think almost exclusively in domestic ways, right? And the fact is that as long as there are wars overseas, Muslim Americans are vulnerable. So the ways in which the civil liberties of Muslim Americans exist or don't exist is intimately and deeply connected to what happens with American foreign policy at the same time. So, and I think that we as a population, as a general population, often feel like we can't change American foreign policy very easily, but we can change maybe the way that things happen inside of the country. But we have to change what's going on overseas. And I think that that's really what's at stake here, is really not just for our own survival, but for the very survival of what this country should be, and really for the survival of the planet in a lot of ways. I don't want to sound too grandiose, but that's where we are.
I mean, I think the theme of, you know, resisting artificial siloing is a really powerful and instructive theme, right? So when you think about the spectrum that, you know, Moustafa was pointing to, sort of that spectrum that goes from the local to the global, and you pause to consider that from the U.S. government's perspective, right? Various U.S. government agencies look at it as a single continuum, right? They don't see a separation between, you know, domestic policy, say on security issues, and what's going on overseas, the way the U.S. government is participating in certain countries internationally. They're looking at a range, from their perspective, at a range of, you know, security policies and practices that can be global all the way down to the most minute local circumstance. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, those of us who care about communities that are particularly affected by these policies and practices, who want to stand in solidarity with those communities and work hand in hand with them to challenge those policies and practices. We're doing ourselves a disservice by accepting that kind of cleavage, that kind of siloing, and sort of focusing more on the domestic versus the international. And the same can be said sort of at a more local level, right? And so when you're thinking about, if you're interested in police accountability issues, right, and you want the New York City Police Department, for example, to function in ways that are more responsible, that are more accountable, it's entirely artificial and to an extent foolish to distinguish between you know, one set of policies and practices that are racist and another. So many, you know, for a very long period of time, to be more concrete, many activists that were working on stop and frisk were siloed off from activists that were working on other police accountability issues. And that was a strategic mistake, and one that I think was corrected recently, because, you know, fundamentally, these policies don't exist in a vacuum from each other. It's the same NYPD that's implementing stop and frisk that's targeting predominantly Black and Latino communities. It's the same NYPD that's doing surveillance, that's targeting predominantly Muslim communities. And importantly, to look at these things in isolation ignores the everyday realities of many people. And I think many people on the panel have made this point and embody this point, that, you know, many folks are Black, Latino, and Muslim at once. Mm-hmm. And so they are subject to stop and frisk in their neighborhoods, just like they're subject to NYPD surveillance in their neighborhoods. And I think in recent years, activists here in New York City have sort of corrected for that and have begun to, you know, draw up those bridges and those alliances to more powerfully organize, recognizing sort of the commonality of the challenge and recognizing that really they're dealing with a common enemy. And that's been a much more effective approach. And I think it's one that needs to be generalized nationally and all the way up to what's happening overseas and the deeply problematic ways in which our government participates in the world.
So if, if you were to give just a list, a few resources of people, to people on, how they can become more informed, not just of narratives that are domestic, but definitely inclusive of distinct narratives domestically in their own neighborhoods. We're in Brooklyn, which is a beautiful place. Brooklyn has a lot of food insecurity issues, a lot of poverty, a lot of challenges. I stood at a park right around here called Yauch Park, named after one of the Beastie Boys, a few months ago because somebody had graffitied it with swastikas and the word Trump and I think Make America White Again, and we had a press conference. And there's realities that are local and across the country and then globally as well. Like, what would you recommend to people to be able to broaden perspective and become more informed, to become more understanding and aware?
Well, it's funny because I feel like after 9/11 happened, then, and a lot of things that have happened since with Muslims being seen as the villain, basically, it reminded me of what it felt like this feeling I would constantly have as a Black American, as a kid growing up in the 80s and the 90s, every time I would see a Black man on the news with his head down in handcuffs, or when I would hear about some kind of crime or whatever, and I would a lot of times I would just think, please don't make the person Black, please don't make the person Black. I just felt like, it just always felt like Black people were just so vulnerable to the act of one person, that our whole community was just so vulnerable. And people would talk about it. And I remember Dave Chappelle, he had a joke about he had this chart on Comedy Central, and when he had his show, and it would be like, oh, okay, Oprah, okay, 10 steps forward, and then it'd be like Little Kim, 5 steps back. It was like anybody's action could take you back, you could just lose, your people could just lose with the act of one, and that it just comes to me. I just saw the same thing played out again, and it has to do with the media, it has to do with, and then also the police, the way that they would treat Black people, and then now it's the same thing, the media and the way that the police would treat Black people, and then and then it filters into the imagination and the minds of the common people, and then also policies that are made, and all of that filters in the mind of the everyday person, and then you get somebody who suddenly they see a Muslim and they snap. And it's a hate crime, they do something, they hate crime or whatever, misinformed, something, they're just hypnotized by something that they heard, and so I think, for the common person, I feel like for me, I just feel like I'm watching the game that's played, and it's the same game that keeps being played, and it gets played on different individuals, and so it just moves around, a long time ago, the Japanese were, they were subject to what happened in the media and all of that, and policies and all of that, and then look what happened. Black people for a long time, and it's, Hispanic people, it just moves around, and it's here's the new scapegoat, the new group of people who the act of one, the act of a few, can just bring them back and just overshadow the acts of so many good people. So it's realize that this is, unfortunately, this is something, I don't want to call it human nature or what, but it's something that we have to resist against, it just hops around from one group to the next. We don't know who the next group is going to be after Muslims, but it will probably be another group of people after Muslims.
So, let me reframe a little bit, using the example of the swastikas at Yauch Park, which I don't know if you all are familiar with it or any of you were there. When I got on the mic to speak at that press conference, I said to people that, that swastika represents to me the darkest potential of humanity, that individuals were so motivated by their hatred and bigotry that their entire objective was the annihilation and extinction of our Jewish brothers and sisters from this world. But it also represents the second dark potential of humanity in that those who sought to perpetrate genocidal violence were only able to be successful because there were so many others who had the means to stop them, but simply just sat back and watched and did nothing. And I think the indifference that kind of plagues society today, that can be rooted in political rhetoric, institutional policy and mechanism, media narrative, like, what do we do to break it? Like, how do you get the 150 people who are sitting here today to be comfortable enough to acknowledge, why they're not angry when a black person gets shot in the street? Why they're not standing when there's literal pipelines leaking oil through lands of real indigenous populations of this country? Why there are drones bombing places all over the world, or why none of us know that there's 30 million people dying of starvation because of famine right now throughout East Africa and parts of Yemen. How do we break that? So what are like specific books, spaces, academics, activists, where do we go where we can experience, can people come to the masjid that you grew up in and experience Islam in like a very lived way? How do we start to now break down that passivity and meet that hate with something that's more positive as opposed to some of the indifference that kind of plagues us? Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think a big part of that is it's kind of tireless work in that you don't get a day off from doing it. I think I'm on Twitter a lot, as I've said before, and I think about the very specific people that I follow, some very specific activists who are working on several fronts to make sure that this stays in people's minds. They do fundraising, they do awareness raising, they are working 24/7. And oftentimes you will see people kind of say to them, you should take a break because this is serious life work. I think a lot of the time it comes from conversations that are happening also, obviously, that include the Muslim communities locally and farther afield, but also conversations between non-Muslim groups as well. There are a lot of times when I'm saying something on Twitter, for example, in a long thread of just stream of consciousness nonsense, and somebody will say, "Oh, can you tell me where to blah blah blah?" And more often than not, a reply will come in from, usually it's a white person, and a reply will come from another white person and say, "Why don't you try reading blah blah blah?" And a lot of the time, that takes the pressure off of me to give information. So I think a lot about the conversations that are happening with Muslims, which are great, in terms of kind of naming your problem. You name the issue, and then hopefully the solution comes from conversation. But I think a lot of the time also, so often Muslims, black people, whoever is being currently subjugated in some way, the onus falls on them to be the one to, which I get, because your problem, you feel it most keenly. But I also think about the fact that we are not the only solutions to the problems. There are so many other people. I think it's that thing about I think a lot about the wave of activism and interest that, post Donald Trump's election. I think I attended the Women's March for work and as a woman. And seeing all these people riled up and angry, and there were some very wonderful, hilarious, incredibly woke, placards and whatever. And some of the ones that I saw that made me laugh the hardest were being held by, for example, black women or LGBT women who were kind of like, "Welcome. We've been here." And I think that was a big thing, this idea of a mass radicalization of, the previously quiet, and suddenly thinking, oh, wait, if they come for those people, they might come for me. And I think that's already something that's begun to happen. I think there is a lot, people are hopefully kind of having these ideas are kind of percolating and churning. So I think that's something that's going on, but it's keeping that energy up. And I think so often basically I'm trying to say white people do better. Yeah. That's the short answer. This is just a lot of waffle. I'm saying do better. I think this is something that falls on not the marginalized groups, but the people who hold some modicum of power outside of those groups to go seeking, to go searching, to go looking for what they can do to help. That's something that I think we kind of fall back, we fall down on. You know, people will kind of express to you, you say on Facebook or on Twitter, oh, this racist thing happened to me today. And people kind of go, oh God, I hope you're okay. And someone might come along and make you some soup, which is nice. But then post-soup, what else are you doing? You know, are you talking to your racist families? Are you talking to your uncle who's a police officer who has objectionable views about various groups? Are you talking to your father? Are you talking to your mother? Are you working on behalf of a local political party? Are you doing things? You know, I think a lot about kind of thinking locally and that kind of having these ripples that kind of extend far beyond. I'm not saying that Muslims and other people should just sit down and wait for stuff to get better, but I'm saying that a lot of the time, don't wait for somebody else to do that. You should be, God, I'm going to do this, but be the change you want to see.
Hey.
Listen, I never said I wasn't cheesy. I'm saying that a lot of the time, this is something that you can do. I think people are waiting for permission, and if that is something that you are waiting for, then allow me, a foreigner in a foreign land, to give you the permission to go forth and do the things that are going to make it better for everyone. That's something that I think needs to kind of keep getting hammered over and over again. You are, again, cheese, you are the one you are waiting for. I think this is something that I can't stress how often this has to be told over and over again, to push harder, to make the phone calls, to attend JFK, and make your voice heard. Do something. You can't wait. And exactly what Moustafa was saying. You have to get to the point where you realize that if they come for your neighbor, they will come for you. And I don't think there's any other way of saying it except saying it. This is not about one person or one group. It's about all of us. We are all in this. And if you take a step back because it doesn't directly affect you today, you won't notice until it's directly at your door. And then it's too late for all of us. So selfishly, I want you to do it for me, but also think about yourselves. It will happen to you.
So I mean, this question, I mean, the way Bim put it, like the idea of post-soup, what else are you doing, right? That's fundamentally a question about sustainability. Are the folks that you saw at JFK, for example, protesting the Muslim ban, are they going to sustain that effort for the next 4 years, for the next 8 years, if Trump gets reelected, right? And more importantly, are they going to organize effectively? You want to participate in politics, then you need an organization to do that. You need a program to do that. Is that happening? Are people just marching, or are they actually forming organizations and formulating agendas that they're then going to follow up on? My deepest, one of my deepest, darkest concerns at this point in time is someone who has been working on these issues, for 8 years under Obama and since the Bush administration, right? Working on issues, working with communities that have been targeted by various policies justified in the name of security, right? My concern is that, when I look at all of these people, all of these groups that are new to the party, as you were saying, right, who are being welcomed, I wonder whether, I wonder to what extent there's an affinity, I wonder to what extent there's alignment between my critique and theirs. Mm-hmm. Because on some level, if there had been a fundamental alignment in our analysis, in our critique of what was going on, then those same people would have been there, right, for 8 years under the Obama administration when the very same results, the very same outcomes were being achieved in far, sort of more muted fashion by the Obama administration, without all of the rhetoric that the Trump administration has been deploying, right, which made it less visible, but no less damaging to the communities who are on the receiving end, right? Muslims, for example, I mean, again, just to focus on some of the communities that we work with, Muslims have been excluded, through the immigration system for 8 years under the Obama administration. President Obama shattered all deportation records. If you work on immigration issues, you know that he's deported more people than all previous presidents combined, right? And yet there was silence from the so-called American left. So you wonder, what drives the current moment of political outrage? Is it really a sort of a principled alignment, a critique, an analysis, a shared analysis of what's problematic about what's going on today? Or is it really just a sense of revolt and outrage at the unseemliness of what Trump is doing? And if this is about seemliness, then if it's really just about seemliness and the fact that the Trump administration is putting forward really a distasteful rhetoric, then I'm not sure that those are reliable allies. I think those are allies that can be placated, right? If the Trump administration tones down its overtly racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, sexist rhetoric, then these allies are going to fall by the wayside. So that's my deepest, darkest concern, right? When we're sort of trying to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to effectively organize, and who are going to be our allies in that struggle? If it's really a sense of outrage at the Trump administration being unseemly and deploying a distasteful rhetoric, then I think we're in trouble if we decide to rely on those sorts of allies.
So we're going to shift to audience Q&A just in the interest of time. I think if people have questions, they could raise their hands. While we're doing that, I think I would add a third frame to what Ramzi is saying is, I would say a lot of people on the left start to speak more so because they now stop seeing Muslims as a liability and they see them as an asset, as a political strategy. It becomes advantageous. So well before Trump, every Republican spoke really horrendously about Muslims and various minority groups. But when he pushed it to a certain extent, it now became beyond detrimental and beneficial to kind of be a champion and an advocate, which is problematic in its own way. Do people have questions? We have a mic that will go through the audience. And we just keep in mind, too, that we try to limit it to just questions and to, in the interest of time, try to keep things as succinct as possible. Yeah, in the back right here.
For me as a Muslim, a lot of things change after 9/11. So I was thinking, is this my religion or something else? I'm from Afghanistan. All my life I have been a Muslim. And I saw how this very radical version of Muslim emerged. It all started after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the Afghan rose against it. At the beginning, nobody took it seriously. They thought the Soviets will crush it easily. But Afghans fought very hard. And then they got the attention of the world. And the United States, the West, the Pakistan, they saw opening. They saw an opportunity to pay back to the Soviets. So they helped the Afghan Mujahideen, and the money came from the Arab Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and now they needed an ideology to fit and go with this very brutal war. And when I say this war was very brutal, I saw it firsthand. When they dropped from the planes toys, that's bombs for poor Afghan village children, that's just they want to kill children. Because the Soviets says, after they realized that they cannot win this war, they said, we just will erase their villages because they were sanctuaries for the rebels. Mm-hmm. So this was really 1.5 million Afghanis died, and 5 million people out of 15 million back then become immigrants and refugees. So this was very brutal war indeed, and they used very deadly weapons on both sides, cluster bombs, napalms by the Soviets, stingers, and all kind of other from the other side.
So, sir,
And-
just in the interest of time, because we want to take other questions.
I
if
just
we
want to
can.
say
Thank you.
that how this version of radical Islam was created, and I have a question to this, because I see what I saw. So they took the very radical version of Islam, which was the Wahhabism. That's a guy who is in the 17th, 18th century, basically. They created in Saudi Arabia, into this Saudi Arabia. This was very harsh version to united all the tribes that going to support the Saudi family, and they created Saudi Arabia. They took that version and made it even more radical to fight the Russians, and that's from what emerged.
Can you articulate the
Al-Qaeda.
question for
So
the
just I'm
panelists?
coming to the question.
Yeah.
So that's how I see the 9/11. This was a political, not a religion. Islam religion has nothing to do with it. My question is this only me that see this, or other Muslims, especially educated, especially who are more, speaks better than me, more elegant, or does anyone else also see this, to explain this to Americans, to this our country now, that this Islam has nothing to do with this? I just want to hear your thoughts about it. Sorry if I took too much time.
No, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I think also just so we can field a lot of questions, if we try to keep responses just to a couple of minutes each, that would be good.
okay. Yes, I mean, I think for just about any practicing Muslim, I mean, you know, the tenets of Islam and the way that we live out Islam. I know the way I live out Islam is as someone who believes in a creator of this universe and who believes in the benevolence of that creator, and that there is, you know, and that we should just attribute all the good to him. And so I pray, you know, fast during Ramadan and stay away from things that are bad and do things that are good, and those are the tenets of it. And, you know, I don't see anyone kind of trying to protest against me doing any of those things. So it doesn't seem like, okay, the tenets of Islam are something that people are up against. It seems like something to do with politics that in many different regions that have a highly Muslim population is to then people say, oh, it's against Islam because these people are Muslim. But it's not, it has nothing to do with the faith of the religion. And of course, people who create any heinous act, that has nothing to do with their faithfulness, their belief in God, because most religions advocate, I think just about every religion advocates for good and for love and respect and kindness. So, yeah.
More question?
Great, thank you. Do we have other questions? Yeah, sir.
Good evening. First, I just wanted to thank everybody on the panel for coming out and speaking and speaking brilliantly on some of these topics. Quickly, as an African-American Muslim, born and raised in Harlem, I would say sometimes, I don't want to use the word offense, but sometimes it's offensive hearing the word that after 9/11, things became bad. Because as an African-American Muslim, served in the Marine Corps, was a correction officer, did 20 years in the fire department. And each one of those jobs, I had to fight. And I had a problem being a Muslim and being African-American. After 9/11, yeah, maybe it shifted to the stereotype of what they thought a Muslim was, but there was always a problem in this country. And I think it's on us as the Ummah, the Jumu'at, as Muslims, no matter what ethnicity we are, to look at that Muslim body and say, hey, do the work, do the history. If you're moving to a country and you see African Americans have had this problem for so long, And Muslims have had this problem for so long. Don't think you're going to come here and it's going to be any different for you. It might take some time, but it will shift it. And then the other comment about the greatest fear. One thing I noticed, being a firefighter for 20 years and responding to 9/11, was that I wasn't surprised when Trump won. In New York City, 90%, more than 98%, 2% is African American or firefighters in New York City. So I was surrounded by a majority of white firefighters who always thought like Trump. The TV was always on Fox. They were always anti-Sharpton, anti-Martin Luther King, anti-Malcolm X. Things were posted in firehouses all over the city like that. There's a firehouse in Brooklyn Heights. They tried to put Trump on the front of the fire truck, and the mayor had to tell him to take it off. So my fear, like you, is I see people still having this thinking, and they're raising children that still have this same thinking. So then I ask myself, how can it change? And I know how I was raised as an African American and as a Muslim. And I know my father made an effort. He sent me to a Jewish camp for 3 years. Yes, because it was kosher food, but at the same time, he wanted me to be around some other people who weren't just African American. I lived in a Muslim country. I lived in Mecca for a year. So I was in the most holiest country, the holiest city, and I saw how Muslims live. I mean, he just made sure that I wasn't just around African Americans. And I think it looks like it's going to be on the shoulders of Muslims to do that, and as part of Islam is already doing that, but to repeat it with our children, and we're just going to have to continue to be the messengers of peace and continue to fight, because I don't believe, from my experience, for the people that I've worked with, Marines, Corrections, and Fire Department, that they are passing that word to their children. It's just being repeated. Sorry for the bad news.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, how was the food at camp? How was the food? But was it tasty? Was it tasty? Yeah. Okay. Great. No. Let me just say one thing about that. That was really eloquent and really important to hear. I do think that there is something about the pre-9/11, post-9/11. Not to say that there wasn't. There were plenty of precedents before 9/11 to the way in which Islam is stereotyped and Muslims have been discriminated against. But after 9/11, I feel like it had become instrumentalized in our politics in a way that's different than it was pre-9/11. So I think that there's something to think, just to consider about that. In terms of, very quickly, just because I think that's really interesting what you're saying too about who's watching what and all of that sort of stuff too, and relating that to Khalid's question earlier about what are we going to do about how to to affect change in the world. I mean, I think one of the things that we should all be doing to affect change in the world is stop watching TV. I mean, there was just a recent study that came out just this week by the Shorenstein Center, which is part of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and about media. This is on Muslims and media representations, and what they followed 3 different networks over the span of 2 years, and they found that 75% of the coverage about Muslims on those 3 different networks was all about ISIS. Right? And that the only times that they also counted how many times that Muslims actually spoke about Islam on those networks. It was 3%. 3%. So, which and of course, there's many other studies that say too that the more you watch Fox News, the less you know about things. The more you watch, that's an actual study, by the way. And the more you watch Fox News, too, there's a correlation between people who watch Fox News and also have racist or anti-Semitic or Islamophobic attitudes. And so, so what are we going to do in terms of all of that? Well, Khalid also asked, what are we going to do about books? Well, of course, you should just read my books, for one thing. And then everybody does great work on this panel. But I also think that I completely appreciate the fact that there's an unseemliness to Donald Trump and that there's a suspicion about we're going to lose our steam and if this is an authentic social change moment or not and all of that stuff. But I also do think that social movements can only be based on fun and love and getting together and really wanting to change the world to be a better place and not out of duty. I don't think that if we're approaching it out of duty, that I think we're gonna lose a lot of people. And so I really appreciate the point of also expanding your communities that you associate with for that, because I think you find other ways of how other people also have fun and what their moments of what their imperatives are, and use your own brilliance, your own genius in your ways. Social change does not only have to come from going to a demonstration. Everybody has their own talents. If we can just use all of our own individual talents channeled in the right ways for the creation of these different kinds of communities that are much more, based on sharing our planet, then what a better world we would live in. So I just want to put that out too, because there was a little bit, I understand the suspicions or the trepidations, but I do think that we have to be, we have to have some joy in it at the same time too.
I think the joy is something that comes because we're human beings and are capable of it. But I also have the worry that when something is no longer trendy, when something is no longer, I'm reminded of the John Waters quote when he kind of says, if you sleep with someone and they don't have, you go home with someone, they don't have books, don't sleep with them. Yeah. And it's kind of like, haha, but also it's kind of true and blah, blah, blah. And I kept thinking, yeah, to an extent, there has to be a case where you have to, there's joy, but you have to think, it is work. It is work. I think about the movements, I think about the civil rights movement, and, Martin had Mahalia, there's music to go with the movement and the moment, and then there's also the actual work of the moment. And I do think about how people are I was on the train after the Women's March, and there were all these conversations, and people were saying, oh, I'm awake now, and I'm fighting now, and I kept wanting to say, to lean over and going to go, please do. It's great that you've come out. This woman was she was a 90-year-old, and she was there with her, 3 generations of her offspring, and she was kind of I'm really fired up, and this little girl, this 6-year-old is going to do, and I was like, that's great, that's really great. I hope, though, that when she gets comfortable again, she doesn't stop doing the work. And I do think, yes, of course, joy, of course, fun, and as we saw from the placards, there were so many Beyonce lyrics out there. I was so pleased to see them all. But I also kept thinking, just please don't stop, because when there is comfort, you do forget. And I think about the motivating tools that, for example, the civil rights, there was something that someone said about, back during the civil rights movement, the thing that really helped was that white people had shame, and you could shame them to be better. And they don't have that anymore. That was the consensus of it. And I thought, well, that's a very important thing for us to think about. How do you make sure that things stay in people's minds, that they keep doing the work? Because old tactics don't work anymore. And sometimes, joy is not enough, even though it's necessary.
Well, I think that what's happened, now is that people have become curious because the name Islam and, Muslim, it pops up in the media so much, whereas, prior to 9/11, yes, there were, like you said, there were things happening in the Muslim community. We had different kinds of issues. Then it wasn't spoken about so much in the news. You didn't hear Islam and Muslims so much. People have become curious, what is this Islam thing? What is this? What does it mean to be Muslim? And then maybe people start Googling or people start researching for themselves, and because you have to form an opinion now, whereas it previously wasn't something that you may have been thinking about at all. And so I think, for me, I tend to think that there is inevitably some good coming out of every kind of situation. And right now, we do see a lot of negative things happening, but we see a lot of good too, because even people, people are now thinking about things that they weren't thinking about, learning about a religion that they knew nothing about. And for a lot of people, discovering a lot of good things about a faith tradition that they perhaps didn't think anything about, or even if they were looking into spirituality, like I said, my parents are both converts, now thinking, oh, well, maybe I want to be Muslim, or, that kind of thing. I mean, for my dad growing up in China, he didn't even think Black people could be Muslim, because he always saw just Indian people as Muslim. But then once he came here and he realized, oh, it's very diverse. There are black people that are Muslim. It awoke something to him for him to start discovering and looking into that. And I think people's curiosity is the first thing, and you're going to have options. Now people are just, you get to decide who you are. Are you going to be someone who reenacts actions of the past, just a new topic, a new subject of people, which is bigotry and ignorance? Or are you going to be someone who looks and wants to find out the truth? Are these just a bunch of stereotypes? Are people just being scapegoated? Are they actually all bad, or is it just some people who are bad and they're being shined a light on? I think that's what's happening.
Well, I think that's a pretty good note to end on. I think we've run out of time for more questions, but thank you all for joining us this evening, and big thank you to our panelists.